Thank you very much. Would you like to join us at the podium, Richard, and just
Sure.
keep going?
Assuming this is all laid out, I just press the button. Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
When I was moving toward becoming 50, I went to see my therapist, and I said, you know, I'm having struggles becoming a man who's 50 years old. I just didn't think I would reach 50. And he says, Richard, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The bad news is you suffer from low self-esteem. The good news is so does everybody. So I'm going to go through some good news and some bad news here, but I'm going to try to create a little bit of a portrait of how HIV is going to look at, or through the lens of HIV, at some of these issues of violence and discrimination, and some of the experiences, and of course some of the good points and bad points. As a first statistic, gay men are 19 times more likely to get HIV than the regular population. And transgender women are 49 times more likely to be having HIV than the general population. So for us at UNAIDS, it's an imperative to actually deal with the health and well-being of communities to be able to address HIV. And that's why we look at things such as violence and discrimination, where it comes from, and what it is we can do about it. I'm going to go through a few slides quickly and then talk about some lessons learned. You've all got a criminalization map in front of you, and we call it Towards a Free and Equal World. And it's to demonstrate where we are around the world regarding criminalization of same-sex sexual behaviors, where things are legal and where things are protected. So we know that we have, in 75 countries, it's illegal to be gay. In 7, you face the death penalty. In 118 countries, it's legal to be gay. And in 62 countries, they prohibit discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation. 8 have constitutional prohibitions. And 35 countries have hate crimes legislation. And you can go on and on about housing and so on and so forth, but the multi-layers of what puts people in that category, what puts them in front of the law, in front of their citizens as being legal, illegal, protected, non-protected, these have a bearing. And the list of countries is on that map. So what we've heard throughout yesterday, today, and even this morning's presentations, discrimination against LGBT, and I have a caveat, we often say LGBTIQQ2S. Just to be politically correct, I include two-spirited, queer, and questioning. But these are part of the fabric of how we look at each other, and sometimes I don't always understand these things, but if this is what people want to be named, and this is how people identify, I'm going to make sure that I acknowledge them and identify them as they want to be seen. We know it affects self-esteem, safety, schooling, housing, family relationships, health, employment, friendships, the whole gamut. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of how this works out across the world. What does criminalization mean? This is a house in Nigeria that 2 homosexuals lived in, 2 gay people. And this is in patois, pack and leave, written on their walls of their house. And where you are subject to mob violence, this is a heavy message, and people have to escape, often at night, from the neighborhoods in order to not be killed. This is in Kingston, Jamaica. This is the sewer, where young LGBT from the ages of 12 to 18 were living because they had no place to go. Age of 12. Living on the streets, this is what homelessness, when you hear about LGBT, in many countries, this is what it's like. Here's in Russia, where this is an illegal group of people who are expressing their sexual orientation, which is against the law. This is in Nairobi, showing solidarity when they were fighting the Ugandan law. Here is in London with expats from the Nigerian community. This is in India, shortly after India recriminalized same-sex sexual behaviors, and this powerful message. And from an HIV perspective, from a health perspective, would you get tested if you could be put behind bars? And we have lots of stories. In Uganda, 8 young men who were promoted to get tested were arrested, standing outside of a clinic, waiting to be tested for HIV and other STDs because they looked gay. Here's the top bureaucrat in the world, Ban Ki-moon. And I'll get back to this statement at the end and to a powerful message from Nelson Mandela about education and what this forum is about and what some of those next steps can be. So let me go quickly into some lessons learned from my years of working in this field. First of all, young people, adults, this merging today, I can't make a distinction between an 18-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 19-year-old. Sometimes those lines are blurred, sometimes they're very clear, and sometimes we fail miserably to protect the youngest, most vulnerable in our group. But young people face the same laws as older people, sometimes even more complex. The first lesson learned to deal with violence and discrimination is that social transformation is underway in all of our countries. No matter where we live, no matter how complex it is, there is a discussion about same-sex sexual relations in every table, schoolyard around the world because people are being arrested or people are today connected in a way that they haven't been before. The pace of change, however, is accelerating. What took us 70 years to get to this point will not take future generations 70 years to get to the next point. This is both exciting as well as uncharted territory. This fast pace of change is creating uncertainty and fear across the world. They can't control the internet, they can't control what you read, they can't control who you talk to anymore the way they may have years ago. Perhaps in China, but within the Chinese community, within China, there are discussions taking place that they can't even block. But this fear and uncertainty has created some pushback and polarization across the world in communities here and across the world. New technology has accelerated this pace, and it's yet led by young people who are changing the way they interact, the way they read, the way they understand information in a way that perhaps puts a lot of onus on us today to figure out new ways of reaching them with information, but also to outreach to them and their allies. Young people are not patient. They're not going to wait for 10 years before they're recognized and their rights are accepted. They are moving at a very different pace than we did years ago. An example, the mass migration we're seeing, the oldest event in human history, continues around the world. 700,000 people have landed on the shores of Europe. Many are escaping ISIS because ISIS is throwing people off buildings if they're accused of being gay. Not even if they are gay, if they're perceived or accused of being gay, this is a way you do with your enemies. This is why the language of bullying of, you're gay is so powerful, because it actually can get you killed in many instances. We've seen many ways to push back. In Nigeria, they didn't push back against gay people, they pushed back against marriage with the anti-homosexual marriage bill. In Uganda, it was a clear anti-homosexual bill. And in Russia, they said, no, we don't discriminate, but we want the anti-propagation law that no one can understand under the age of 18 about this other way of living, other sexual orientations and identities. So different countries have used different approaches, often head-on, often not head-on. What is clear is that social cohesion of the past is being replaced by new ways of families and operating and people moving to cities. And that social cohesion that we used to know is part of the problem, leading to, in some places, extremism, or how fast can we move when we're replacing one way of operating with new ways that have not yet been defined or accepted in the community. So, social transformation underway in all our lives, in all our communities, in our families, and we've either got to get on the boat or you'll see a lot of pressure against it. The second lesson learned is about well-being and happiness. These aren't overstated, and in fact, increasingly people are looking for these global goods. The issue of violence and discrimination are interconnected, but they are multi-layered and complex relationships guiding the way you've talked about yesterday, the norms that we've had operating and guiding our relationships through millennia are now being replaced. but they're complex. What we're understanding that the HIV lesson is that we have to look at people holistically and ecologically, rather than a standalone, siloed approach. I want to deal with this issue. In fact, we've got to look at people in a much more broader way. We need to pitch, for instance, the economic cost of homophobia on economies. Lee Baggett, who has done a study of USAID, the World Bank, and now working in UNAIDS as well with some of the studies we're looking at, is trying to describe those costs to the economy, to the community, when you have homophobia and when that leads to violence. We're also trying to demonstrate that progress is happening. There's nothing better in the world than to back a winner. Leaders want to be part of the winning side. They want to be able to see that progress is possible and are looking for that to happen with them. One of the publications that I do to try to demonstrate this, and I will put it on the backboard at the end, it's equal-eyes.org, to be able to demonstrate around the world where progress is happening and where challenges continue to happen. And this demonstrates to all of us that, in fact, when you hear the bad stories, there's some really good stories happening alongside of these. So well-being and happiness now are part of our remit. It's not just looking at the virus and sticking pills down people, but in fact looking at them as entire human beings. The third lesson learned in the struggle on HIV and violence and discrimination is that you need to confront misinformation and conflation. This was evidenced yesterday as well. So when I ask activists from Nigeria, Uganda, Russia, and others, now that you know, what would you have done to stop that legislation that came forward? They all boldly said we would have dealt with the lies and misinformation that was seeded into the public. As we know, in the body politic, perceptions and misinformation, if left unchecked, become reality and become truth. Combating some of that is really what they said is all about. So we need to address this issue of misinformation. I think was stated yesterday, there's different ways of doing it, and the rhetoric that comes along. I think Reverend Capia and others made that very clear yesterday about trying to stop this misinformation. Thank you, Pauline. You made a very strong comment about that as well. Another new way, and we've heard it yesterday, a number of speakers talked about this neo-colonialist approach, where people are able to somehow look at you and say, you from the north have different ways of operating, we have different cultures. Alison Combe, a lawyer from Cameroon, says, be careful when they try to throw this card at you, because human rights is a global good. It's not just for us to have different rights or for the North to have the right of liberty and freedom, but it's the right of every human being on this planet. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Do not be sidelined by that kind of pressure. I was really happy to hear from Patrick yesterday about the role they played in supporting the Academies of Sciences of South Africa to come up with a seminal report that is, to me, the most important thing on this issue. They came up with a report called Diversity in Human Sexuality and Implications for Policy in Africa. In it, and I'm going to quote, efforts should be focused on countering the belief systems that create hostile and even violent environments. This is said by the academic and medical community. These are important pieces in our allies, but confronting misinformation is really what is going to be required with data and evidence, and these kinds of documents coming from those communities to be locally owned. You could start to cut at those arguments being made that somehow it's constructed in the West. We also have to find new ways to disseminate this information. The fourth lesson learned is that criminalization matters, but it's not all. We also need access to justice, policing. We need this to go into the family and impact. As an example, you saw that picture of the man holding the sign, I'm a criminal in India. One of the things that happened in India following recriminalization of homosexual behavior was that a number of people who used to came out were now looked at by their families as criminals. When we did not criminalize homosexuality, you were a member of the family. Now many people look at their family members who came out and said, oh, we now have criminals in our midst. So there's a whole new process of re-educating the family and the support systems that are needed, but how an entire country of 1 billion people was plunged into another dilemma of we've got to go under the bar when it comes to some of these issues of addressing their needs. The law in Uganda that was overturned by the Supreme Court requested that teachers, social workers, parents, doctors, and priests had to report gay people to the authorities or risk themselves a jail term. Some of these laws are being used to either impact you as a family member, you as an individual, and being a criminal in many cultures is just simply not going to be able to work. You're not able to come out. It also has an impact on the services you can provide to these people. So you're not going to get health services, mental health services. They're not going to come to you because of that problem of many of these laws. In Cameroon, these laws are used in another way. For instance, judges who are uneducated will look at what you're drinking, consider you're effeminate, and move you and take you to jail. And there were cases of men who were drinking Bailey's liquid, in a bar, and were arrested by police because they were considered that as a female drink, and that they were male, and they were put into jail without any evidence whatsoever. And of course, the shame that brings to families and to so on leads to even further violence and homelessness when they do leave these incarcerated places. So these are some of the examples of criminalization, and that the law does matter. The fifth lesson learned along this path, and I heard it yesterday a number of times, is about visibility. Visibility counts. Humanizing LGBT people makes a difference. I think if you're American here, you would have heard about Caitlin Jennings and her television show, and you've seen in the past year the impact for transgender people in this country, but across the world, that visibility is brought on this, from television to daily lives. We heard yesterday about soap operas. Well, Will and Grace, as a television program, had the most impact around how Americans viewed LGBT people, and led to some of those changes in public opinion which allowed the law and marriage and other laws to start to move forward toward where public opinion was. So reflecting society and having people in society being reflected in our eyes makes a difference to all of us. As the former Prime Minister of Iceland said at a meeting that I attended last year, she said, "I hope to see the day when young people can fall in love and still dream of a future." And those words were really meaningful because young people are becoming more visible at a rate never seen before. But they're also aware that this leads to violence, discrimination, and increasing levels of violence as visibility increases. What you don't see, it doesn't matter. And years ago, they never came out. People who were gay were somehow left on their own, and it didn't seem to bother people. Identity now bothers people because they are considered a group and want to be considered as a group. Sixth lesson learned was leadership matters. Recently from Tunis, the Minister of Justice says, "I don't see any reason why we continue to criminalize gay people who do things in private. It's not good for us. It's not good for our economy." In Kenya, the Prime Minister came out 2 weeks ago, to state emphatically that although he himself does not necessarily agree with decriminalizing homosexuality, he stood up and said, but mob violence is wrong, and he wants to persecute anyone who starts to come out and violate LGBT people in mobs because of their orientation or gender identity or perceived. You also have in front of you a statement from the United Nations, an historic statement on ending violence and discrimination against lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender, and intersex people. Never before has the United Nations come up with a statement such as this, signed on by 12 UN agencies, and there are two more that have signed on recently that still aren't here, talking about protecting individuals from violence, investigating, prosecuting, and encouraging states to take a certain way to protect people from violence, torture, and ill treatment. Strengthening efforts to prevent and monitor. Recognize that persecution may constitute a valid ground for asylum, which we're seeing across the world today. And you'll also see repealing discriminatory laws is something the UN wants to push and work toward, and that states need to protect individuals from discrimination as well. So, what does this say? Leadership gives permission to people to follow. They set the pace, they set the pattern for how we want to look at our society. They legitimize some of this action, and it helps to educate people and allies in that next step. Nelson Mandela, and I was worried yesterday, not worried, but perhaps listening to the word about what's that delay between where public opinion is and where people can move with the law. This is where bold leadership made a difference. He spoke for the need to include in their constitution the protection for this group of people, of LGBTI people, despite the fact that the majority was not there behind him. He nonetheless pushed forward. My last lesson learned is about allies and partners and collaborators. We have to reflect the interconnectedness of our work, and we need to broaden that education. And I stand very firmly before you in saying that sexual rights and I'm going to say this, SHRH, sexual health and reproductive rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and the laws that govern how we look at the people who have to deal with their rights and sexuality. There's three groups of people that need to collaborate in a different way today. We need to see women, the LGBT community, and young people combine forces and collaborate in ways they have not before. Sexism, homophobia, and racism affects us all. And these are three groups of people that can move an agenda, need to move an agenda together, particularly to ensure that their rights and access to reproductive health and rights are maintained. And as I heard yesterday, more people need to ring the bell. And we have this group, and we need to figure a way to combine our forces so we ring that bell very firmly in our ways that are possible in our context and in our cultures. Thank you.